This is part one of the Housing and Refugee episode of the 10 Minutes On podcast. This episode will be hosted by Nathan Maguire.
Well, welcome to 10 Minutes On Housing and Refugees, a podcast from the Joint Public Issues team. My name is Nathan Maguire and I'm the Campaigns and Church Engagement Officer here at JPIT. Today we have a series of conversations where we'll be diving into some crucial conversations around homelessness, housing and refugee resettlement. Joining me today are two people who are deeply involved in this work. We have Bonnie, who's the Chief Executive from Housing Justice, and we also have Joe, who's the Housing Justice Refugee Lodgings Officer. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you, Nathan.
So before we begin, Bonnie and Joe, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work and what you both do.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm Bonnie Williams, the Chief Exec of Housing Justice. We're a Christian charity that takes action on homelessness and housing need. And we operate right across England and Wales, and we're about to start in Scotland as well. And we run a wide number of projects, but the common denominator between our projects, which are all aimed at helping people to find and sustain homes, is the role of communities. So we're really about communities and the role that they can play, particularly faith and community groups, and the importance of the role of love, nurture and belonging, and how communities and volunteers can make real difference to people when they're at vulnerable points of their lives.
Brilliant. My name's Joe Rinvolucri. Yeah, I sit within the Housing Justice team in the Migrant Homelessness Prevention team, and more specifically working on to coordinate a project called the Refugee Lodgings Project, which we'll discuss today. And I've been doing that since sort of March of this year.
Brilliant. Thank you both. So to start, let's look at how homelessness and refugees are portrayed in the media and the broader public discourse. These narratives play a major role in shaping public opinion and policy, but they often lead to misconceptions. For example, as of 2024, the UK homelessness population has been steadily increasing, with over 271,000 people recorded as homeless in England alone, including rough sleepers and those in temporary accommodation. And among them, 126,000 children are without permanent home. Additionally, the cost of living and the lack of affordable housing are pushing more people into the brink of homelessness. Bonnie and Joe, those are some stark figures. And what are your thoughts on how the media narrative shapes society's approach to homelessness and refugees?
Yeah, I think it's really important when sort of addressing this question of kind of misconceptions and narratives around refugees and homelessness to, address what the source can often be of those particular misconceptions. And that is, as you mentioned, Nathan, kind of media narratives and media framing of these issues at hand. I think an example of that, perhaps in terms of with sort of refugees and asylum seekers, is that we can often see that the coverage when it comes to kind of homelessness, when with refugees and asylum seekers, can focus a lot upon, for example, hotels being used to house asylum seekers and the money that kind of goes into that. And there's a lot of focus upon that kind of financial aspect and this whole sort of idea and supposed necessity to kind of clear the asylum backlog and clear these hotels. And what that does is it means we then don't focus so much on the actual individual plights of the people within those hotels, for example, and the idea of actually, the state of repair of these hotels, the kind of overcrowding that can occur, the safeguarding issues, etc., can be largely sort of overlooked. And instead, it can sort of fuel this idea that refugees or asylum seekers receive some sort of kind of special treatment, that they're benefiting from the system when it comes to housing. And actually, when we kind of zoom out and look at the reality of the situation, it's very different from that. I mean, firstly, when you look at the situation for someone who has just been granted refugee status, obviously that should be, really a kind of moment of celebration, a moment, you may well have gone through a very kind of long, arduous, emotionally exhaustive process of going through the asylum system. And so it should be a real moment of celebration when you're kind of welcomed into kind of UK society. Instead, the reality that a lot of people are met with is that they are given 28 days within which time they're expected to, find a job, find somewhere to live, navigate an already incredibly competitive housing market. And, if they want to start claiming benefits, that's going to take them 4 to 5 weeks, about time outside of that time frame. And at the end of that 28 days, they are likely to be evicted from their kind of asylum accommodation. And what we've seen as a result of that is a real kind of steep rise in the numbers of refugee homelessness. So there's an organisation called the London Councils that did a survey of people sleeping rough in London that were coming out of asylum accommodation. And they found 93 people were sleeping rough in September 2023. And that number had risen to 311 in January 2024. So a 234% increase. So like a real increase there. And so that's the kind of reality of the situation. And I think, again, where perhaps our media framing and narrative doesn't kind of cover an area where they don't sort of cover so much is, again, sort of the additional barriers that refugees may face when trying to access housing. So we're talking about, a lack of renting history in the UK as a result of often not being able to work whilst seeking asylum. They will might have a lack of employment history, no UK-based guarantor, language barriers, all these sorts of things that kind of can make it very much difficult to kind of access housing. And so I think we need to perhaps sort of move away from this, what can be the kind of media framing of a sort of us and them mentality of kind of us as the general population kind of suffering within a housing crisis and them being kind of those that are somehow kind of benefiting, and actually realize that, we share a lot of the same kind of problems in terms of lack of affordable housing, lack of rent controls, and that there actually are also additional barriers that kind of refugees and asylum seekers face that need to be addressed.
That's really, really helpful. And I think certainly a real challenge there to, I guess, help people be more informed about some of the challenges that refugees specifically face. And Bonnie, I'm wondering if maybe we can also look at some of the problems that just generally around homelessness and some of the misconceptions. There's this term that's often used as voluntary homeless. And I remember being in a local context and kind of coming up with barriers against even just that term, and people thinking, well, why are people voluntary homeless? What are some of the misconceptions generally and broadly around homelessness?
Yeah, as Joe said, it's just really unhelpful labeling and particularly involvement of the media and unhelpful press coverage. No one is ever voluntarily homeless. And I would say the same, that no one ever chooses to beg on a street. And I think, there's some really divisive issues here. But really, we have to think about, do people grow up with an aspiration to be sitting on a wet, cold, dirty pavement, begging other humans for money? I mean, that is just nobody's life choice, right? And in the same way that coming to the UK as an asylum seeker, it's not necessarily your first choice. I mean, look at the passage that people had to take to come here, the trauma of that journey, let alone the trauma that they may have been facing before that, the lack of community opportunities straight away, how hard people have to work to find out basic information, to get provision, to have a shelter when they get here. It's not really anybody's first choice. And I think, as you say, it's so important that people do familiarize themselves with the true information. We've got AI now and we've got the internet. It's really, really easy. And actually, when we look at true migration figures into the UK as of 2024, June this year, we can see that actually safe and legal humanitarian routes resulted in 75,000 people coming into the UK. We granted visitor visas at over 2 million. We granted work visas at 547,000 and study visas at 530,000 and family visas at 84,000. Small boat arrivals, which we're all led to believe is the beginning of the end of society in the world, accounted for 31,000. It is a tiny, tiny proportion, and yet the media would have us believe completely the opposite. And actually, the desperation of people getting onto those boats, it's really heart-rending just to think that they're so desperate that that is the best choice for them at that point in their life, as is someone potentially begging on the street. I just got to come back to it's nobody's first choice. And so I know that the media and the constant messages can start to impact on people's thinking, but just urge people just to look it up online, ask AI. It's so straightforward these days to get the truth.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of the Housing and Refugee episode of the 10 Minutes On podcast. Stay tuned for part 2.